This lesson starts a series on Jeremiah, whose prophetic ministry overlapped those of a bunch of other prophets, such as Nahum, Zephanaiah, Habakkuk, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Huldah, the woman in the group. There were several other women prophets. And this was all around the time that the southern kingdom of Judah went into exile after wavering between alliances with either Assyria or Egypt. Jeremiah was dubbed the weeping prophet for good reasons. His entire adult life was spent delivering harsh negative truth to his people, and such a life and mission invites personal attack. It's a very biographical book in that it continually tells of the prophet's own feelings and experiences and the tragedy of being denied the companionship and acceptance he always wanted, and the refusal of Judah to repent. By the world's standards, he was an abject failure, but by spiritual standards, he was a hero. So we see here in chapter 1, which for some reason I forgot to, that's the chapter we're going to end with today. We want to go back to chapter 1, not 21. So that's what we'll begin with the next time. So let's go back here. And the book focuses almost exclusively on Jerusalem and Judah and the consequences of being unfaithful to God. Like the book of Proverbs, it's more a collection of oracles, or burdens is what an oracle means, than a developed or chronological theology. So there's a lot of repetition for emphasis. So we'll see the same things rolling over and over in this book. We should also be aware that this book has the most variations between the Masoretic and Septuagint text. So Masoretic being the Hebrew text that is used by most English translations, and the Greek text is the Septuagint. So there's a lot of, and that's the one that Jesus and the apostles quoted from. And there's a lot of differences in between the two in this book, though none of it really impacts any significant theological teachings, because again, this is more about impending doom than it is about teaching a theology. So now let's go down to verse 5, which starts off with a familiar phrase, before I formed you in the womb, I chose you. But like any familiar phrase, it's rarely understood and often twisted. It's a couplet, so we have to take both lines together, and the choosing was for a task, not salvation. God knew Jeremiah's character and personality and raised him up to do a certain thing at a certain time for a certain people in a certain place. That's the context. His response to God's calling, which likely came when he was a young adult, was humble and realistic. But God's response was for him to be brave, because God would go with him. And that should be all any of us needs, but we're often afraid of what God might ask of us, which in Jeremiah's case will turn out to be pretty harsh. But do we really trust God if we're afraid to give him complete control of our lives, is the question. So now let's go down to verse 11. And Jeremiah is given a vision where God gives the meaning of the symbols, which all have to do with impending doom on Judah especially. And then down in verse 17, Jeremiah is ordered to bring the message to them, and it comes with a serious threat from God if he doesn't carry it out. It's very much like the one many parents have used: if you don't stop crying, I'll give you a reason to cry. He could expect to be attacked, but God had commissioned him, so there would be no excuse to be afraid of the attackers. It's never wise to rush into a hostile environment without God's sanction, but it's also not wise to fail to go there if God has ordered you to do so. And that's the big if. You have to make sure that God has sent you there. There are many Christians who have taken it upon themselves to spend a lot of time studying the occult, for example, and then they wonder why they're having certain kinds of demonic oppression, because if God did not send them specifically, it's not a wise thing to do. So now down to chapter 2, it begins with God lamenting the good times when the people of Jerusalem were faithful and could be blessed. But as we see down here in verse 5, God asks what he ever did to deserve their unfaithfulness and their idolatry and ingratitude. So if we look down in verse 9, God presents his case against them and their descendants, who else among the nations of the world had dared to change gods? And a foolish trait it was. After calling heaven and earth as his witnesses in verse 12, God then rebukes Judah down in verse 14 for its dependence on alliances with foreign nations who only turned on Israel and destroyed it. The chapter goes on to describe Israel's idolatry and stupidity and how it eagerly pursued its enemies' favors. But as God says in verse 28, let the gods the people chose come to their aid. And yet all the punishment in the world had failed to make Israel come to its senses. It had gotten to the point where in verse 33 that God said that prostitutes could learn a thing or two from Israel. It was that bad they were chasing after other gods. But starting in chapter 3, God says that a man can't take back a divorced wife who had married someone else. Some conclude from this that God could not have divorced Israel, even though it's clearly stated in Isaiah that he did, and other passages. Yet even here, since Israel had been a prostitute and was thus defiled beyond repair, God eventually took them back. Some translators have the end of verse 1 as a plea for them to return, but it's really more accurately rendered as here in the Net Bible, what makes you think you come back to me? But rather than God violating his own laws, he shows a degree of mercy not seen in Israel, and remember that these laws are by God, not for God. The purpose of the law was to keep men from treating women as worthless toys, which could never be the case with God. So he doesn't need to be under that law. And we see in Hosea 2:16 and 3:3 that God ordered the prophet to take back his unfaithful wife, the prophet there being Hosea, as a picture of God's great mercy in spite of Israel's great shame. So the principle behind the law stands, and God himself does not violate that principle by taking back sinners who repent. So this is a common thing that critics bring against the Bible, and if you don't look at these things carefully, you'll be taken in by those critics. So then after more rebukes for Israel's lust for false gods, in verse 3 here, God explains that this is why their land had been experiencing famine, though Israel still didn't learn the lesson, even being so deluded as to think God would just overlook their continued habit of sinning. And then in verse 6, it begins another message where God tells Jeremiah that though Judah saw what had happened to the northern kingdom of Israel, it didn't repent, which is even worse since it had seen that and still didn't care. So down here in verse 12, God orders Jeremiah to shout to his people in the north to come back, but only after admitting and repenting of their idolatry. Blessings would come to those who did. So per verse 14, again, I don't mean to say per verse, I say per verse 14, is how, he's explaining that these blessings would come to those who repented, but by the description, it's about the millennium, when the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah are reunited and the nations bring them tribute. There's no way to turn from a land in the north to the land God gave as a present possession into an allusion to Christian salvation, since the north has no meaning as a spiritual condition. So when you see that phrase from a land in the north to the land God gave as a permanent possession, we're talking about actual land on the earth. Now down in verse 19, God is still speaking, and he expresses his deep disappointment in Israel for throwing away the bliss and blessing they could have had in exchange for all these false gods. And as we see in 21, these are the gods to whom the people would cry and moan for help. So, as we'll see in chapter 4, God gives them the ultimatum that they have to completely rid themselves of those disgusting idols before he'll take them back. And now another message comes in verse 5 that warns the people of Judah and Jerusalem to make their choice quickly because disaster is about to strike from enemies to their north. And then as Jeremiah hears this, in verse 10, he cries out to God, but the message of doom continues, and it's interrupted several times by Jeremiah's expressions of despair. And then in chapter 5, which is kind of a distance away, you can read through that, God asks if even a single person can be found who is honest, and if so, God would spare the city. But there isn't even one, which was the same as Sodom and Gomorrah, if you remember that. And then down in 5 verse 4, the hope was that only the poor and ignorant were this way because they didn't know any better and they didn't have God's instructions. But even those who knew God's commands well ignored them. So skipping past more indictments against Israel and Judah, we go down to verse 15, where God pronounces judgment via an ancient nation from far away, which commentators believe was Babylon, far to the east of Israel. Even so, we go down to verse 18, God will spare a remnant because God promised Abraham he'd be the father of many, and when God makes promises, he keeps them in spite of themselves. But in the meantime, the people will be deported to the land of the foreign gods they love so much. But the whole case against them is really summed up in verse 31. The prophets lie, the priests replace God's authority with their own, and the people love it that way. Are we any different? Many Christians choose pastors to rule over them and browbeat them for any disobedience. Many citizens choose despotic leaders and keep re-electing them to abuse them more. We love the familiar and traditional more than the sensible and responsible because we don't care who rules over us as long as the hamster wheel keeps turning, as long as we have our cookouts and jobs to run to and entertainment in the evening. We don't care. Now in chapter 6, it begins another round of dire warnings, and then another prophetic message begins in verse 10. And understandably, Jeremiah asked God what good it does to sound warnings at all. But he's tired of holding in the message, so he's commanded to vent it anyway, though it will do no good. The passage goes on to show how at every turn the people rejected every blessing they could have had, without shame or remorse, in spite of everything that had happened and was about to happen. So now we go down to chapter 7, and we'll see that God has Jeremiah give more dire warnings in the very gates of the temple, which the people considered proof of their invincibility. And then down in verse 11, we see a passage Jesus has quoted when he drove the merchants out of the temple, which shows at the very least that he had no problems with the God of the Old Testament, as the critics love to claim. They were doing the same thing in his day that they were doing in Jeremiah's day, only giving lip service to God while committing every imaginable sin. And then down in verse 16, we see a very surprising thing. God tells Jeremiah to stop praying for them. 1 John 5:16 says something very similar, to not pray for the sin that leads to death, which isn't identified, but the point is that we shouldn't try to find out. Don't push to the point where you find out whether you've committed a sin that leads to death. Even God loses patience, and when he does, there's no stopping the consequences. But who is this Queen of Heaven in verse 18? At the very least, it's a false goddess according to the context, but it's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. The commentary's opinion is that it referred to the Babylonian goddess Astarte or Ishtar, whom the people of Judah were worshiping during the reign of Manasseh. So that's all we can really say about that. So now let's skip down to verse 31, to a place called the Valley of Ben Hinnom, where the people were actually offering their own children as burnt sacrifices to Molech, which God certainly never told them to do. Because critics, again, will say, I saw in the Bible where it talks about sacrificing children, therefore the Bible teaches we should do that. That's complete nonsense and cherry picking and twisting. But before we look at a little bit of the details of this, we should ask ourselves if our apathy toward abortion is any better, since collectively we barely offer a weak protest. This is the place Jesus called Gehenna, which he used as an illustration of eternal torment. In this context, the place where the people were murdering their children would become a mass grave for the murderers. The fact that they would never be properly buried was considered a terrible curse, which will happen again to the two witnesses of Revelation 11:9 and to the Gentiles in Revelation 19:17 and 21. Now, as if that hadn't been enough humiliation, we go down to chapter 8 and see that God says that Later on, the invaders will dig up the bones of the dead to be scattered and left out in the elements so they can worship the sun, moon, and stars one more time. In other words, God is saying, you love those sun, moon, and stars so much, let's get you back on the top of the ground so you can stare at them some more. Even so, God says that the few survivors will wish they had been among the dead. It doesn't get much worse than all that. And then we go down to verse 7. After more expressions of exasperation, God says that even animals have more sense than his people. The teachers of the law had twisted its meaning, as many have done to the Bible over the centuries. And skipping down to chapter 9, it takes a little bit. Oh, just went right past it. There we are. We see that Jeremiah got his nickname, the weeping prophet, because right here he's saying, look at me crying. And then in verse 3, it's back to God lamenting that he has to punish his people. And the warnings continue through the end of the chapter and into chapter 10. So we'll go down to chapter 10. And notice, especially in verse 3, we have details of making an idol. Cut down a tree, shape it, decorate it with silver and gold, set it on a stand, and then worship it. What does that sound like to you? If you said, well, a Christmas tree, but we don't worship it, remember that gifts are also placed under it. And the materialistic frenzy of buying the gifts seems to be the most religious thing we Westerners do these days. We mean well, hopefully, but sometimes I think we should stop and think about what we're symbolizing or honoring as Christians. Now let's go down to verse 6 and forward, which contrasts these worthless idols with the one true God. And notice also down in verse 16 that God says his name is Lord of Heaven's armies. This presents a problem for what is called the sacred name movement, which insists that we call God only by the Hebrew name Yahweh or Yahuwah or some similar thing. Shouldn't they now say the Hebrew for Lord of Heaven's armies? And then use something else out of respect, the way the Hebrews had always done? So substitute anyway and not say the sacred name? So again, what makes a name sacred is who is meant. That's the point of the sacredness of God's name, is honoring him in word and deed, not saying certain syllables. Because the Hebrews, even out for a different motive, that being respect, would not say the sacred name. So what's the point of that movement? Anyway, it's back then in the text to a description of impending doom, and then there's another message in chapter 11. If the page will just roll there we go. To remind the people of Israel of the covenant they agreed to so long ago, which they repeatedly violated. And then if we go down to verse 14 in chapter 11, oops, that rolled a little too far. Jeremiah is told not to pray for them, and again God demands to know why the people think they have any right to be in his temple. But in verse 18, Jeremiah is shown that the people are plotting to kill him for all these messages of doom that God made him say to them. In their eyes, he was a traitor, a doom and gloomer, an ant at their picnic. So now that it's personal, Jeremiah turns from weeping to let him have it. I think shooting the messenger is the most ancient of sports, which is why it's no fun to be the messenger. But of course there will be a day of reckoning for the shooters, according to verse 23. So now we go to chapter 12, where Jeremiah then asks the question we all ask, why do the wicked prosper? But though he wishes death upon those who want him dead, he doesn't take matters into his own hands, but waits for God's vengeance. Though his own family had turned against him, God cautions him down in verse 6 not to trust those who smile on the surface and seem nice because things are about to go from bad to worse. Don't trust those smiling faces. And then yet again, down in verse 14, God also promises that the invading forces will be punished as well for their own sins, once God has used them to punish his people for their sins. Notice also that God will allow a surviving remnant even for them, but only of those who turn to him, and those who do will be considered part of his people. But in chapter 13, God has Jeremiah live out an object lesson, which was a common practice for Old Testament prophets. So a lot of times God would have them do certain things that are sometimes much harsher than what we'll see here in Jeremiah. But if we go all the way down to verse 23, excuse me, we see what seems to be an overtly racist statement. Can the Ethiopian change the color of his skin? The word for Ethiopian or Cushite was a derogatory term meaning burnt face. So it's clearly about people with black skin. But what God is really saying is that this is what people say. And God would ask them what they think these Ethiopians are supposed to do to avoid being mocked for this, for something that they can't control. So that's what God's angle on this is you say you mock them for their skin color, but how can you do that? They can't change their skin any more than leopards can't change their spots. So God is not mocking leopards, is he? That's how we know the meaning of this statement. It's not racist because he's making a couplet or a comparison with leopards being unable to change their appearance either. God made both the way they are, so who is anyone to mock on that basis? And the point in this context is that sinning had become so deeply embedded in the nature of his chosen people, they could no longer repent. It was impossible for them because that's the path they not only chose, but persisted in. The New Testament equivalent of this concept is seen in 1 Timothy 4:2, regarding those whose conscience has been seared as with a hot iron. There comes a point when you can't revive it anymore. And then we go down to chapter 14, where it continues the details of what will happen to such people. And we've gone, well, I went past, I wanted to go down to verse 14 in chapter 14. Sorry about that. And the focus turns to the people's love of false prophets, which is often true of Christians today who have no discernment because they can't be bothered to study the Bible or listen to those who have. And in verse 17, we see that it isn't just Jeremiah who's weeping. It's God himself, because the people he loves only hate him in return, so they have to be sent away. Jeremiah begs God to remember his covenant and spare Jerusalem, but it was Israel and Judah who broke it. This is a common attitude against Christians today. People say we're intolerant and judgmental, but it's the critics who have those faults. Of all the faith communities in the world, ours is the one most others unite against, because they cannot tolerate salvation by faith in Jesus alone, or anyone defending the Bible instead of bashing it. And then we go down to chapter 15, where God says that even if Moses and Samuel stood before him to plead for mercy for Israel, God would not grant it, nor feel any pity for them because of their sin was that bad. Whether that brought any comfort to Jeremiah, we don't know, since he was being told that it isn't because he's not a worthy prophet that this is happening. But as the message continues, we see that it's God who has the right to ask why and to be given pity. Now we go down to verse 19, where God actually has to rebuke Jeremiah not for whining about how he has to suffer for the messages he brings, but for actually implying that God has been remiss in allowing it to happen. We have to be careful as well not to cross that line. And we haven't been made to suffer to the point Jeremiah was, as we see down in chapter 16, where God tells him, don't marry and have children in Israel. But the reason, of course, is that the land was about to be devastated, which Jeremiah knew, as opposed to our situations where we don't have any warning about the future for our personal lives. He wasn't even allowed to mourn the dead or sympathize with the grieving. It was going to be that bad. And in verse 10, we see that in spite of all they had done, the people had the audacity to ask God what they've done to deserve the punishment. Yet as God says down in verse 14, he still has an inkling of hope for return from exile. He's giving to them, distant though it was at the time, they would still have this hope in spite of everything. And then the text goes back to warnings of doom down through chapter 17. Critics love to taunt, see, your God is so weak and narcissistic that he lashes out at people just for not loving and obeying him. But who are they to talk, since they too lash out and oppress those who don't accept or agree with them? As Jesus said, the wicked only love those who love them. So what right do they have to condemn God for what they themselves do? We should also tell the critics that Israel had agreed to obey and serve God by covenant, but they broke their promises, not to mention that they were burning their own children in sacrifice to other gods. Even the most jaded anti-Christian should demand the death of those who do such things. Now we go down to verse 19, which focuses on an example of what that broken covenant was. And it was the abandonment of the people not observing the Sabbath day. And again, this was God's covenant with Israel, and we're not Israel. And then we go down to chapter 18, where we see another real-life object lesson for Jeremiah to carry out. He was to observe a potter who on occasion would give up on a piece he was making and form it into something else. The lesson was that Israel should have known its place as the clay and not the potter, such that they had no right to complain if he changed his treatment of them for their faults and unworthiness to be blessed. In fact, according to verse 16, they would become an object of horror and disgust for their grievous sins. And then after more pleas from Jeremiah for God to protect him, if we go down to chapter 19, it's another object lesson involving a jar of clay. But critics love to twist, especially verse 9 here, that it's another case where they do about they take this out of context and say that God condones cannibalism. Though, of course, it does no such thing. The people would be so starved and desperate as to eat their own children and then each other. This is a curse from God, not an endorsement of evil. But the critics will do that. And then, if we go down to verse 10, Jeremiah is to break this clay jar to illustrate what's about to come on all these proud sinners who, among their other sins, have been worshiping the stars. As with other such passages, remember this when the critics say Christians are sun worshippers just because S-U-N sounds like S-O-N in English. That's how bad they are. But if we go down to chapter 20, we see that Jeremiah was then flogged and locked up in stocks for speaking the truth that nobody wanted to hear. The stocks were designed to keep a prisoner in a very uncomfortable position in view of the public, so it added insult to injury, which is hard to take when you've done nothing to deserve it. So this is what happened to him. So we can sympathize with Jeremiah down in verse 7 when he reminds God that God had to push him into accept being a prophet, had to twist his arm. And it was the mockery and ridicule that hurt him most. But he could no more hold back from giving God's messages than he could hold back fire. If only Christians had that same problem, holding back the gospel. We can also sympathize with what Jeremiah says down in verse 10 about his so-called friends who watched him closely to find an excuse to denounce and betray him. Yet, like Jeremiah, we should cling all the more to God during such times so that our suffering won't be in vain, and the wicked will get what they've got coming to them because they earned it. Yet again, we can sympathize in verse 14, where Jeremiah wavers, and forward from there, wavers between singing God's praises and wishing he'd never been born. So we've got a lot of things we can sympathize with Jeremiah about. And we're going to stop here for this lesson and continue with chapter 21 next time.